Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Anti-Federalist Radio, providing you with libertarian perspectives and opinions on current events for the liberty-minded. We are taking the fight to the airwaves as we stand for liberty, oppose tyranny, and give equal opportunity in exposing the hypocrisy of the Democrats and the Republicans. Without further ado, here are your hosts, Joe and Joe.
Hey, folks, great to be with you again tonight. I'm Joe, your economic host. And for tonight's special that we're going to be covering in tonight's podcast is something a little bit different. So normally what we do is, I will usually give you the economic bits of what's going on and as my own perspectives and insights on what's going on in our lives today and the markets. And then my counterpart, Joe, the activist, will give you the social commentary insights in what's going on. However, in a very twist of events, what we are seeing is something that is well beyond economics today. So to have a proper economy, it presupposes that in society there is a thing that we like to call civilization. And in that civilization, that's where markets are set up and everything is constructed and used. And it relies off voluntary cooperation. It relies off of respect for the mutual rules of law. And it also regards a thing called property rights. So it is where there is a mutual respect for other people's property rights are not being violated, that sort of thing. And even if such, rights were violated, there are legal recourses to try to mitigate and prevent that. What we are seeing today that's going on is a total breakdown of society. We no longer need to worry about economics because we can't have proper economics without a society. So one of the things that we're going to discuss with, and it's going to be basically the sole thing that we will discuss tonight, is what's going on, what the hell is going on in the United States today. Minneapolis has been set on fire. America is completely burning down. There are riots in the streets, people who are frustrated and fed up and have resorted to violence, vandalism, pillaging, and looting to try to make their point across. And we're going to discuss all aspects of that today. We're going to discuss what's the cause of this, what's the source, where do we think this is going, has this been building for some time, and how do we reach out to that? And I'd like to discuss with Joe, and we also have a special guest coming on, Joe Garcia, who is now the vice chairman of the Libertarian Party of North Carolina. He was a former NYPD officer for many years. He will be coming and giving us his own personal expertise and insights into, the kinds of issues that we're going to be talking about tonight. And so, going with that, with this entire breakdown of society, I'd like to discuss the political reactions to this. What was the Democrat Party's reaction to this? Not just the mayor and the governor, but, what was the entire Democrat Party? Because they are one of the two major party systems inside the United States today. How did they approach this? And what was the Republican Party response? And particularly, what was President Trump's response? And so those are going to be some hefty and weighty issues to go through. And then, as libertarians, of course, we're neither Democrats nor Republicans. We don't agree with either one of them because, quite frankly, we think both of them are wrong. But then, the question is, what has been the libertarian response? Has there been an official libertarian response? And then, lastly, what should the correct response be? So that being said, Joe, are you on?
Yep, I'm here.
All right. So as I was covering with my first bit, we're not having a proper economic system. We need not worry about that today. So let me ask you, Joe, what was your reactions to what was going on. So there were 3 stages to this. So first off, I think the trigger, we can all pretty much bog this one down, was the unjustified killing of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police officer. And then second off was the protest, the initial protest response to this. And then third off, the protest divulging into outright riots and looting. What as a libertarian, what are your responses and feelings to this? And I'll give you mine afterwards.
First and foremost, when you join the Libertarian Party, we have a platform that covers pretty much every issue that arises in the United States. But the one thing you specifically check a box on is that you agree to the non-aggression principle. And the non-aggression principle is more or less self-explanatory. It's not pacifism. It is not turn the other cheek. They strike me on the left, so I turn the right so that they can strike me there. The non-aggression principle is very simply, I am never the aggressor, but if someone is the aggressor against me, I may defend myself. And fundamentally, as a libertarian, you have to stay grounded in that to some degree. Well, not to some degree. You have to stay grounded in that. But as we assess this, they started as peaceful protests, and they rapidly became non-peaceful riots with mass property damage. A few things need to be said about that. The first is that riots do not have leadership. They are a mass of people spiraling out of control. No one is directing that kind of thing. And the second is that while I fundamentally oppose rioting, it has to be understood that this is inevitable. In my own lifetime, I saw the protests after Trayvon Martin died, the peaceful protest after Trayvon Martin died that brought about nothing. And in my own lifetime, I saw Ferguson, Missouri burned to the ground after Michael Brown was killed. And after that, every police officer in the nation had body cams. If you are going to reinforce the precedent that you ignore peaceful protests, but you cave to violent rioting, you're going to have violent rioting. God, Colin Kaepernick's been kneeling during national anthems for 5 fucking years. Like, how long has he been in the NFL? Like, how long have we had, just since Ferguson, Missouri, high-profile, nonviolent protests that we just ignored? This is an inevitability. And just in the past weeks, I am losing track of names. I can't keep up anymore. We just had Breonna Taylor killed in her sleep. We just had Ahmaud Arbery. Like, in the past few weeks, the high-profile killings of unarmed African Americans and the peaceful protests that aren't bringing about everything, now the entire country's on fire. And it also needs to be said that I don't really believe your protesters and your rioters and your looters are all necessarily the same faction. Now, faction's a very formal word here, and overly formal, and there'll be some bleed over, of course. There's no doubt there's people that are protesting that are also joining in the rioting, and there are rioters that are here to loot. But as a base rule, I do not believe anybody that's in this for a flat screen TV is willing to get tear gassed for a dead man. I don't really believe that the looters are the rioters. In some cases, sure. But I think the looters are mostly the parasitic vultures that are flying in and looting the corpses. I'm not going to say who my employer is. I'm not going to say what company I work for. But I work for a chain store. And we are now having the first night that Greensboro had riots, a group of people raided our store in the middle of the night in and out, knew where they were going, knew what they were doing, hit the doors, broke in, grabbed something, broke into specific places in the store to loot small things that they could resell at a high value, otherwise get a hold of, loaded them into backpacks and went. And I want to emphasize, this store is miles from the city center and miles from the rioting. Those people have nothing to do with the protests or the rioters. They're not in it. They didn't raid my store in the name of George Floyd. Stick it to the man. Those are parasitic opportunists taking advantage of a preoccupied police force. So those are my feelings towards that. I don't really feel like these people are all the same. I cannot condone the rioting, but I also have to look at it. It's like, if you reinforce negative behavior, you're going to get negative behavior, and we are reinforcing negative behavior when we do not meet the demands of protesters until they burn a city down. Back to you, Joe. And you are listening to Anti-Federalist Radio. We are on your wavelength.
So my own thoughts on this, and I think libertarians are torn on this, is that I was appalled at the death of George Floyd. Let me clarify there. Let me specify there. I was just appalled by it. The fact that I watched the video, cop had his knee on that poor man's neck for at least 4 minutes after he had already been handcuffed, and he was not resisting arrest. He was not even trying to struggle. And him yelling out, basically gasping for breath, trying to say anything, and saying, I can't breathe, was just horrifying to watch. And one of the things is that I think it was pretty one-sided about where the blame, was where the blame should be placed. Because one of the things I do is I listen to right-wing talk radio. I do this because there really isn't much on libertarian talk radio to listen to. Libertarians are usually very well known on podcasts, but they're not on radio. So I listen to right-wing talk radio just because I like to listen to what they say. Usually I find myself agreeing with about half of what they say, disagreeing with the other half, and recognizing that they're a bunch of hypocrites and such. But the Rush Limbaugh originally came out and, he did what I thought was pretty typical. He tried to cover it and smoke screen a little bit. And what he basically said was, well, he had the knee on the back of the man's neck. So it may not have been cutting off his passageways access to air because he did not have it directly on the trachea, which was the front, which I thought was BS, because all we have to do is run that through the scenario and say, okay, had the cop not put his knee on George Floyd's neck, would George Floyd be dead? The answer is no. Therefore, when the cop put his knee on George Floyd's neck and kept it there for over 4 minutes for no reason at all, zero reason to do it, regardless of whether Floyd died there or died later in the hospital, which is what the coroner's report shows, that he died later on in the hospital due to the injuries that were inflicted on him, regardless of which the cop injured George Floyd, the injuries led to his death. So Rush Limbaugh was completely uncalled for doing that. And that was pretty much typical, because that's usually what you find inside of right-wing propaganda. When you listen to the Republican side of things, they usually like to defend the use of government force. What I was shocked, though, is that Sean Hannity comes on in our area right after Rush Limbaugh, and Hannity came out and he had civil rights people on there, and they were all in agreement, Hannity included, and says, no, there's no justification for this guy. He should never have killed him. And I was very pleased by that, shockingly. I was expecting Hannity to blow further smoke. But that tells me that if at least 50% of Republican right-wing talk radio, and it pretty much came out after that, other talk radio shows for right-wingers came out and started being in large part in agreement with Hannity. If they have done this and, they're in agreement with, the left, as well as what most libertarians, that this was an unjustified use of police force, it was pretty obvious. This has, gone on. It has spun out of control. And like you said, Joe, I think they've tried the Martin Luther King Jr. route of peaceful protest. It did not generate results. It did not generate change. They have become fed up, and George Floyd's death was basically the straw that broke the camel back. And so now all chaos has ensued because it was just a bottleneck of anger and rage that has vented out. And it has vented out in multiple ways. I think a lot of these people just want to exert their own hatred and anger of what's going on and basically damage everything in sight, or certain things, like the police precincts and the police cars, to let it be shown that there's going to be a cost today. Somebody's going to pay. But unfortunately, the way that it has been released and unleashed has not been channeled in a positive or constructive way. It's in a destructive way. And this is a lack of leadership, of a failure of both sides to listen to the plights of the people. And this is the result.
Hey, Joe,
that it's
sorry
going to be.
Sorry to cut you off there. We've got Joe Garcia on the line. Would you let me to go ahead and bring him on?
Well, sure. Yep, I saw that he was on there. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks for holding, Joe. We've got you on the line with Joe and Joe.
Hey, guys.
Hey, Joe. How's it going?
Good. Thank you for having me.
All right. So now tonight is not going to be just the Joe and Joe show. It's going to be the Joe and Joe show.
For those that have been following for a while, you are much more likely to end up on the show if you're named Joe. Our very first caller was named Joe, and all of our anonymous callers will henceforth be named Joe. And now our second actual requested interview is named Joe.
I'm glad to be here, guys, again. Thanks for having me on.
All right. So with that, Joe, can you give us a little bit about your background? Just go over about, what you have done in your life and such. I mentioned that you used to be a former police officer for the NYPD. Is that correct?
Yes, I was a police officer and a detective with the New York City Police Department for 20 years. Retired back in about 2014. And currently, I am the vice chair of the Libertarian Party of North Carolina.
Okay.
Oh, so you stepped up into Brent's position.
Yeah. Took over for Brent when he moved up to chair. I was elected the other night, so straight into the gunfire.
Well, happy to have you up there.
Thank you.
So, Joe, there's a few questions that we like to ask you. So one is that being a former police officer yourself, and obviously this is something that, although Joe and I are both former military, especially Joe, he was a former Marine. I was just a Navy sailor. I don't think that we can completely appreciate the kinds of stresses that you yourself had to go while you were on the police force, that you had to incur and endure. Can you kind of give us your perspective on the shootings as being a former police officer and, of course, a devout libertarian now, on, the kinds of effects that it had on you? Do you think that it was justified, unjustified? Why? Those kinds of things.
Okay, so in this particular case that happened here in Minnesota, okay, actually, let me back up a second. So being on the street, there are times when you go to arrest somebody, and there are people who will be compliant, right? So they'll turn around, they'll put their hands behind their back, they'll let you cuff them, they'll get on the ground, they'll follow every word that you say, and you go to put them in the car, and they'll get in the car, and they won't give you any trouble whatsoever through getting from the street to the station house, from the throughout all of arrest processing, and then you get them downtown, and they'll be compliant the whole way, and everything's great, right? That's the optimal situation that as a police officer and even as a detective that I always wanted. Okay, I don't want to have to fight with somebody. I don't want to have to pull my gun on somebody. Nobody, most police officers don't want that. They want to come in, do their job, and go home, right? But there are times where the person who you're trying to place under arrest, okay, does not want to go to jail, okay? Now, my background is I came to treat my job as a business rather than, a calling or something like that. It was more of like, okay, my job is to enforce laws. Their job, in a sense, depending on why they were doing what they were doing, was to be the bad guy in a sense. All right? So if you just went and robbed a lady for her purse and then took off with it, you broke into somebody's house because you have an addiction that you need to feed, whatever the case is, their job was to do what they're doing for whatever purpose, and then they don't want to get caught, right? Nobody wants to get caught. So there were times where you have people that want to fight with you, they want to wrestle with you, they don't want to go to jail. And what I mean by fight, I don't necessarily mean that they want to square off and pick up their hands and start swinging at you. But a lot of people instinctively, and I'm sure that you guys would probably do this yourselves, right, is if somebody went to go handcuff you, you might kind of jump back a little bit. You might pull your hands away because, especially when you realize that your freedom is about to be taken away, that can be a lot for people, especially if they haven't been arrested before. That can kind of freak them out. So you do get instances where you have to wrestle with people, and you might try to grab one arm and you have a cuff on one hand, but their other hand is free and they're swinging it around. So you and or your partner might have to try to grab that other arm to get it behind them. And a lot of times it's not as easy as people want to think it is, right? And hopefully the outcome is you're able to use as little force as possible and get that person under control, right? But then there are times where, sometimes it ends up on the ground. People wrestle, they're kicking at you, they're swinging at you. You and or your partner and that person fall over each other. There are times when that happens, but no matter what, at the end of that encounter, when the cuffs are placed on that suspect, okay, that's it. It's game over, right? That's where that should stop. Okay, you've got them on the ground, they're in cuffs, and that's it. You make sure you have a hold on them so they can't run away from you, and then you try to get them in your vehicle, and you get them back to the station house. Now, do some suspects that you have under arrest want to go and fight? Yeah, okay, but then there are a lot of departments, like when I worked in the NYPD, had a specialized unit, the Emergency Services Unit, that if we really had a problem with a suspect and we were having a problem getting them under control, we could call them and they would come and assist us, right? But again, once those cuffs are on, that's it. The fighting stops, the wrestling stops, and that's it, okay? Looking at this case in Minnesota, when I first watched it, there was like a quick 2-minute video that was being posted all over the place. And I didn't really want to Monday morning quarterback the police officers because it was only showing the first bit of what happened. And the end of the video was actually cut off. It was kind of just at the very beginning where you see them by the back tire, and it only goes about 2 minutes and 50 some odd seconds in. And I was kind of like, I don't want to say anything about this because, it's not enough to go on. But then I got my hands on, there was about a 10-minute or so video. And watching that was pretty bad too, right? Now, in the beginning of the video, it looked like, so they were already on the ground, and Officer Chauvin had his knee on Floyd's neck, okay? But it looked like originally that his right hand was free, because that's where the video starts. They're already on the ground, right? And it looks like his hand was free, and then it sounds like maybe they were trying to still cuff him. I couldn't tell because you didn't see on the other side of the vehicle. But there comes a point where you see he's not fighting anymore, okay? And also let me back up a second and say, I don't know of any police department, and maybe things have changed since I've been out. I've been out of the police 6 years. Every department has different styles that they teach their officers to subdue in. But I don't know of any police department off the top of my head that has trained anybody to put their knee on the back of somebody's neck, okay? So I'll qualify what I'm about to say where I'm going forward now. But there comes a point in the video where he stops moving around, and Officer Chauvin still has his knee on his neck for what I counted approximately 7 minutes. Okay, I could be wrong exactly. I'm talking approximate here. About 6.5 to 7 minutes, he's got his knee on this guy's neck after he's not even moving around anymore. There is no reason for that. I'm sorry, in my professional opinion, there is no reason for that. Okay, now maybe if he was still fighting and, you happen to still be on top of him, and again, I'm not saying that he should have had his knee on his neck, but you could almost kind of understand it. You're wrestling with this guy, you're tired, maybe, you're leaning on the vehicle or something like that. But he was not fighting. He was not resisting at that point. And what we watched in that last 6 to 7 some odd minutes was just that guy losing the ability to breathe. And just you watched him expire under Officer Chauvin's knee. And there was no need for that. Okay? And, look, I'm going to probably catch some flack for this from some people I know in law enforcement. Look, I get it. Certain, people do things, there's laws for them, but I try to explain to them that I've been a libertarian now for a while, and I try to explain to them some of the laws that you enforce, right, don't necessarily have a victim per se to them. Like nobody got beat up, nobody got shot, nobody got burned, nobody was raped. And some of the laws that you enforce, you end up doing it either at the point of a gun or physical violence. And I also use this for people who say that there should be a law for something. Like somebody wants a new law, like a law for now that we're dealing in the realm of COVID-19. Like there should be a law that you have to wear a mask. It should be a law, or you should be fined or go to jail or something like that. And I try to explain to people at the end of that law isn't a woman or a man in a suit from Congress that's making that law, or your state legislator making that law. There's a person in a uniform with a gun belt on, with a bullet-resistant vest, that's going to be the one enforcing that law. And you have to understand that, if somebody decides they don't want to go to jail for not wearing a mask, bad things can happen at the end of that law, right? But in this case, I don't mean to ramble on, but it's just, and I watched the video because I felt like in order for me to comment on it, I had to see it. I'm not into watching snuff films, but if I'm going to be out there commenting on it, especially among my peers, that I had to watch it. That was my duty to watch it. And I don't even know how that officer was allowed to walk and why it took, the burning of Minnesota for that to happen.
Right.
Thank you for your commentary on that. And it's
I'm sorry,
special treat to hear from us. No, you're fine. It's a special treat to have an officer with the NYPD on for this case. I have a bit of a more personal question for you, Joe, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Now, Joe mentioned that he and I are both veterans, and I know how a person goes from being that type of state employee, that type of government worker, to ending up libertarian. I know the philosophical journey that goes because I made that philosophical journey, and I know several of my Marines that are now libertarians that made the same philosophical journey. But I would love to know, were you a libertarian first? Were you a police officer first? And what was the philosophical journey of, how did that go?
Okay. So I'll back up even earlier. I grew up in a kind of like an apolitical household. My parents weren't very political. I would say they were socially, I hate to use this term, but they were socially liberal and more on the fiscally conservative side. I grew up in a middle-class household. My dad was a blue-collar worker. It wasn't, we didn't really talk politics in the house. My dad really never divulged to me growing up why he voted the way he did, and never even really discussed who he voted for half the time. It was just more certain. There were certain things socially that they were very liberal about. Then there were certain things that they were conservative about, but mostly I would say overall socially liberal. And my dad always tried to be somewhat fiscally responsible, teaching me how to save my money and how to write a check and how to keep a checkbook and how not to just go out and spend money every Friday night when you got paid so, you weren't broke the next day type of thing. And essentially I went through public schooling like most people do. And, the police are viewed mostly in a good light, right? Back when I grew up, 70s, early 80s, police were seen pretty much in a fairly good light, especially in the neighborhood I lived in. It was a mostly white neighborhood. You barely saw the cops around, except if maybe there was a homicide in the neighborhood, which we didn't get many, maybe one or two a year. I don't even remember the numbers when I was growing up. But you barely heard of a murder in my neighborhood. You'd see them if somebody had gotten their pocket picked or their purse snatched, especially as drugs became a little more prevalent as the 80s rolled around and all that. But you still barely saw cops. And at that time, growing up, New York City was in pretty bad shape. I mean, there's plenty of movies out there you can watch to get a good sense of what New York City looked like. Movies like The Warriors and like The Bad Lieutenant and The French Connection. You could see how kind of run down New York City was back then. And Mayor Giuliani and some of the higher ups in the NYPD had come up with this quality of life stuff, which is kind of when I came on the police force. And it was their thought process was if you take care of the small things, the bigger things take care of themselves. Meaning, if you get rid of the squeegee guys and you get the homeless off the street, and you ticket people for triple parking, and various other minor things, okay, that the ability for somebody to hang around and maybe be a getaway driver kind of goes away because you don't have all these cars double and triple parked all over the place. And if you get people for graffiti, it'll bring up the value of the buildings in the city and want people to come here more and so on and so forth. And like I said, basically grew up thinking if it's a law, then it must be right because that's what we're taught growing up, right? Unless you're growing up libertarian or you're growing up in some other household, right? And you've never been arrested. Nobody in your family's ever been arrested. You just think like the cops are good. They're there for a good reason. And if it's a law, it must be right. But so carry that on. 9/11 happens. I end up becoming pretty much a neocon at that point. I had lost 2 family members in the North Tower on 9/11. They were civilians. And I became a let's bomb the Middle East until it turns to glass type of person. And, it was more out of, hurting for 2 family members that I loved that were very loved. And they were good people. They were secretaries and, they just went to work that day and ended up dying. And for what? And then, you start buying into, and on my part, foolishly, the whole they hate us for our freedoms thing and they're just here because they don't like us. And, never really taking into account because I really wasn't a student of history of the Middle East. I liked World War II. I liked the Civil War a little bit. I liked the Revolutionary War, but I wasn't deeply read into it all. I definitely wasn't in on Middle East politics. I've only known fractions throughout my life that I paid attention to. And I kind of bought into that storyline. And then, it wasn't until there was this guy named Ron Paul in 2007 that's on a debate stage in South Carolina where he's going up against my boss, Rudy Giuliani, my former boss at that time, Rudy Giuliani, and, basically telling him how this is all blowback for our foreign policy. And that was like my gold pill moment, or some people like to call it red pill. That was my gold pill. And I just saw how, Dr. Paul would not back off. People are asking him, you should, we really think you should apologize to Rudy Giuliani for what you said. And he stood fast on that. And it made me think. And then I started paying attention to Dr. Paul, and I started watching a lot of his interviews and had seen how no matter who was interviewing him or how they tried changing the question on him, his answers were always the same. He didn't change his message for any audience out there. And essentially, I figured it's got to be it's not even just beliefs, but it's principle, right? He's not going to change, and he's not going to morph like most politicians do, right? They want to get the best leg up for the audience that they're speaking to, but he never did that. And little by little, I started looking at myself, the world more around me. I started realizing how much of a sham the war in the Middle East, the current war in the Middle East that's still going on, is. And then I started really looking at certain things that myself as a police officer and a detective was doing, or not really what I was doing. I had a very good career. I have to knock on wood and say I never had to shoot anybody. I never beat anybody up and threw them in the hospital. I wasn't running guns. I wasn't selling drugs. None of that stuff. I was I consider myself a good guy. Some people who might be listening to this will say, well, all cops are bad because you're enforcing unjust laws. I understand that. But if you listen to what I said earlier, not a lot of people understand when they become officers what role they're playing in enforcing the rules that have been set by the states, right? They just think their laws, they're good. But when you start putting it into context like, well, slavery was a law at one time, would you enforce that? When you start thinking of these things, then you start considering other laws. And, is that really just to enforce that? Like early on in my career, I looked at, writing a seatbelt summons. I really thought what? Hey, if I give this lady a seatbelt summons now, hopefully she'll wear it next time, and then she'll never get another ticket again. And God forbid she gets into a vehicle accident, she won't get thrown out of her window. But you don't really think of it at the time when you're and I'll call it it was propagandized because that's how we're taught in school and in movies and everything else, right? And you start thinking what? Maybe that was a single mom that has a couple of jobs, and maybe she was on her way to a second job. She just forgot to put a seatbelt on, and she wasn't hurting anybody. And now she got this ticket. She can't afford to pay it because she needs the money to pay her rent and her electric bill and her, food for her and her kids to eat. Now she's scofflaw because she can't afford to pay the ticket. Her license gets suspended. Either now she can't go drive to work and she has to either take the bus or get somebody to, she has to walk to work, or now she has to risk driving and getting pulled over with a with a license that's been suspended, and now she has to go to jail to answer for that. So those are the things that I started thinking about at that point, and then you just come to realize that there are just some laws you maybe shouldn't be enforcing. It's not really worth it. And then there are other laws like that too. Too many for me to think about off the top of my head. But I started thinking about things like that, and as time progressed, my libertarianism grew more and more, and I am where I am now. Being an activist, working with the Libertarian Party of North Carolina. I think that I will say I think that libertarians, and I understand their distrust of, and some of them have really, really heavy hatred for the police. Totally understand that. But I think if you need to put something in perspective, if you're going to call somebody a pig, a thug, all these other things, right, realize that most of them, might not have done anything wrong other than enforce unjust laws, that they don't realize that where their standing is, right, in the whole, their cog in the machine, where they're at, okay? And also, if you think about it, if somebody yells at you and starts calling you names and cursing at you and everything else and demeaning what you think is okay, right? Like if you think you're an okay person and people start calling you all sorts of names and they're saying that you're evil and all this other stuff, what tends to happen, right? They tend to shut down and they don't want to listen to your argument. I've seen it time and time again, okay? So I would only ask maybe libertarians to try a different approach when they're talking to law enforcement officers. Now, I'm not talking about like this guy, Officer Chauvin in Minnesota. He's a piece of garbage, that guy. I'm not talking about that. There are plenty of cops that you see every day that they think they're just doing their job and they're doing the right thing and it's lawful because it's a law in the books. Maybe try having a conversation with them rather than yelling at them and calling them names. That's all I'm saying with that. Because I think we need, right? Like I think it's important how many, I hate to see it, but right, how many people have joined the military since 9/11, right? Because they thought they were doing the right thing, they were protecting freedom for their country, and they went over there with the best of intentions, right? I would never call any of those people murderers and thugs and all that because they didn't know, man. Same thing with cop shows and movies, right? There are a lot of movies out there that propagandize us into thinking that everything that America's done in their foreign policy is right. I don't know how old y'all are, but I'm in my late 40s. Okay, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, man, where especially the 80s. You could watch most action movies that were based around military things, and it was like rah rah, USA can't do wrong, and the bad guy. It was at the end of the Vietnam War and the beginning of stuff in the Middle East. Either your bad guys were Vietnamese or Southeast Asian, or they were Middle Eastern, right? So just remember that, people have to come to their own awakenings, and sometimes throwing stuff at them and yelling at them isn't going to get them to where you want them to be. Sometimes it needs to be a conversation.
So, Joe, speaking off of that, I think you're a good point because you're touching on something that I wanted to ask you. As moving and having that kind of police and law enforcement experience, and you are now in a position of leadership at the Libertarian Party for North Carolina, what do you think should be the libertarian response to the unjustified use of police deadly force against citizens such as George Floyd, and as well as what do you think should be the libertarian response to the riots? Because I think what we're seeing is the scales there's no balance. The scales have tipped from one side to the other. So we've seen the unjustified use of force by the state against its citizens, and now we're seeing the unjustified use of violent force by the citizens against other citizens and everybody else, including the state. So
right.
I'd like to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? Because minority communities, especially the African American community, has had this systemic violence against them for so long, right? That and instances and incidents have come and gone, right? And sometimes we've had reactions like this, with these riots and stuff like that. But then eventually they end, right? And then what happens? The systemic, enforcement and violence continues in their communities, right? So it's hard to say, but you kind of understand. You have to understand why what's going on now is going on, right? And I've seen some people say, but why, the cops did this, so why not go after the government buildings only and leave the mom and pop stores alone? You got to remember that it's people are frustrated and they don't, they're just acting out, right? Because they feel like they've been ignored for so long, right? They, a lot of activists have been screaming about this for years, right? And what happens after there's a little bit of violence at some of these riots, after each of these incidents, what happens? Things go back to status quo and nothing really changes, right? So they're very frustrated. But, as a libertarian, while I understand the frustration, and I get it, right, our philosophy is that, if you're aggressing against somebody, you're wrong. So, if I own a store and somebody's coming to break in, I'm going to defend that store, and whoever is coming to break into my store and to loot it is violating the NAP. But it's, they don't want to hear that. It's hard, man. It's hard to really say what the right response is, right? What the right response should be is that laws should be changed and policies should be changed, right, within police departments, with the way qualified immunity works, right, and how officials and even departments, it's mostly individuals, can get out of being responsible for their actions in a sense, other than going to jail. But how many times does that happen, in a lot of these cases? So it's really hard to say, but, I don't condone any violence against people who had nothing to do with this tragedy, right? With this crime, this murder, basically. That's what I'm going to call it. But you do have to understand that these communities have had frustration building up for years and years and years, and this stuff continues. So the answer is, politicians and legislators have to work with these departments and get them to change their policies. And I think a lot of it, too, is what a lot of people don't realize is policing used to be very reactive a very long time ago, meaning, not that they stood in the station house per se, but they weren't really patrolling a lot, or sometimes they'd stay in the station house, they'd get a call, and then they'd send the patrol car out to go check something out. Modern policing changed back in the early 90s, and they made it where they wanted to make the police more omnipotent, right, by having an omnipresence, to have the marked police cars out in force to kind of deter people from committing crimes. And then they started getting into keeping statistics for arrests and crimes and everything else, and tickets and all this. And what happens is that when you do that, you start to create this system where you need to do better than you did the week or the month or the year before, right? So we always hear, stats being thrown out. Oh, last year at this time there was, 5% less homicides than there are now. You'll hear that. Well, they do the same thing for arrests and for summonses also, right? They give them, it's a quota system in a sense, especially for tickets, and even arrests have a quota system in a sense. It's not as bad as the summons is, but they do have them where they expect one arrest a quarter, which really isn't hard. If you work when I worked in New York City, I mean, if you couldn't get one arrest in 3 months, there was something wrong, because there were enough people doing, enough bad things that you didn't even need to go look for somebody just to make an arrest to make that quota. It was easy enough. Somebody did a robbery, burglary, whatever it was. But summonses is a different thing too. It incentivized, cops to go out and write summonses so that they can make their quotas. And of course, you'll get departments tell you there's no such thing as quotas. I don't care what they tell you. There were quotas, because guess what? If you didn't write your however many summonses a month that you were supposed to get at the time, guess what? You needed to take a little time off because you had to leave early. Yeah, maybe the lieutenant or the sergeant, they would give you a hard time about taking that time off, or they wouldn't let you get that time off. Let's just say, you had to go bring your car in for a repair and you want to leave early. Well, sorry, man, can't do it today. You're going to have to find another day to do it. And it happened. And that was an incentive, but nobody will ever admit to it, but that's what was going on.
Well, thank you, Joe. It was absolutely delightful getting your perspective on all this.
Yeah. And like I said, it's hard, man. When you look at these communities and what they've been putting up with for so long, and where do they project that anger, right? So both things can, you could be on both sides, right, and say, listen, the cop did the wrong thing, and he should go to jail, and everybody who was there who allowed him, the other officers that were there should be in jail too, because nobody stopped that guy. Nobody, not once did any other officer that was at that scene even attempt to stop him, right? And on the other side, you could also say, I don't necessarily condone the burning down of, John's paint store or, Mario's pizzeria. You could be on both sides, but, you could also be, in the third portion saying that you understand why people are doing these things, So that's how I feel on it. It's frustration, it's anger, and I get it. Where it goes from here, I hope that I hope there'll be some changes in policies that will not allow certain things. I think qualified immunity should go by the wayside. But the problem with doing that too is that qualified immunity was actually meant to protect officers from like frivolous lawsuits where they did, when nothing was wrong. There's nothing that could be proven. The problem is that, a lot of times in some of these cases, unless you can prove and clearly, unless there's something that's been clearly established that's been wrong in the past, that might be considered unconstitutional, right? What happens is sometimes you can't get around qualified immunity. So, like, for example, and I'm just throwing this out there, I don't know if this is a case that actually happened, but let's just say 3 years ago there was an officer that had his knee in a person's back on the ground, and that person died, right? At the time that happened, there was no policy or law that kept an officer from doing that, okay? Now, we move forward 3 years, and again, I'm just making this up, to the case in Minnesota, and now you have the officer with his knee on the back of Mr. Floyd's neck, and he expired, he dies, in that fashion where he's got a knee on his neck and he dies, right? Qualified immunity might still protect the officer today because what was established 3 years ago by not putting your knee on somebody's back has nothing to do with putting your knee on somebody's neck, So, qualified immunity is one of those things that, and trust me, there are people who bring lawsuits against police departments and officers all the time, and a lot of them are frivolous, but there are instances like this where qualified immunity might protect, the people who do these things now and in the future, and that, sometimes officers might not think of the consequences of their actions because they feel that they're going to have qualified immunity.
Well, thank you for your input on that, Joe. Joe, does that wrap it up on all that we need from Mr. Garcia?
I'm satisfied.
Okay. Well, Joe, we thank you for your time. We don't want to take up any more of your time. Of course, you're always welcome to stay on. But we're going to give our input as well as cover the Democrat, Republican, and Libertarian responses to this whole riot and protest that have been going on around the country. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on, and I hope to talk to you all about soon.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Joe Garcia, once again, the Vice Chair for the Libertarian Party of North Carolina, former NYPD, giving us his own expertise and insights into what was going on with George Floyd's killing and as the result of that. So therefore, moving into a broader perspective now, the mayor has come out and, at first originally, I think the mayor was of Minneapolis was kind of in shock as to the pouring of outrage that was going on with the riots that have come out in the streets with Floyd's death. And I think, Joe, you touched on that it probably was not just George Floyd's death. That was just the straw that broke the camel's back. That was my phrasing of it, and I think you're right. But did you read Donald Trump's tweet in response to the riots, and what were your thoughts on that?
Donald Trump, you can summarize it with the last line of his tweet in reference to Minnesota, which was, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. He's already threatening live rounds on rioters and looters. He's also made there were protesters at the White House, and some got through to the lawn, I think, and he's already taunted them in tweets and posted about how heavyweight Secret Service was in dealing with them, and something about some weird ominous weapons that he didn't really go into detail on. He is stoking these flames.
Right. So it looks like we've got another caller on. I'm going to go ahead and bring him on. Let's see what his thoughts are. Oh, wait a minute. Paul may be screening him now, so I'll wait on that. So
All right.
Did you hear? Did you read what Donald Trump has basically moved through to label Antifa as a terrorist organization?
Yeah, I did see that.
I was kind of shocked by that, to be frank on that. I honestly don't know what to make of it. I didn't even know Antifa was there at the protests and the riots. Have there been any news articles covering that? Because I haven't been seeing it.
Well, I'll give my piece on it. I've never been personally involved with Antifa. And I'm not going to speak to their beliefs because what I've read, I don't especially like. The basic fundamental of I am anti-fascist. Yes, good. Fascists are bad. But you very seldom see examples of Antifa protesting peacefully, and violence is a pretty critical part of what they do. They don't even claim to be nonviolent. But never mind that. I'm going to emphasize on what Donald Trump is doing with this. As of now, there is no legal precedent for declaring an organization a domestic terrorist organization. There are no domestic terrorist organizations. We don't recognize domestic terrorist organizations. We have hate groups, I think. I think there's legal precedent for calling someone a hate group, but not domestic terrorists. And the dangerous thing about what he's doing is, one, we don't know how he's going to do it. We do not know what legal power he is going to use for this, or if he even can. And two, flashback to 2016. I think it was 2017 actually. The Charleston riots and protests, when a white nationalist plowed a Dodge Challenger through a crowd of people. Donald Trump insisted in the aftermath of that there were very fine people on both sides. When he was faced with actual mass murder, I believe it was 1 death, 10 injured, attempted mass murder, the pictures that came out of that were incredibly horrific. Somebody got a camera immediately behind the car as they did it. You can see mangled bodies flying through the air. It's very horrific. He said there are very fine people on both sides. And now, which I am sure Antifa has presence at these riots because Antifa always has presence at these things, he's saying he's going to declare them something that we don't know. We don't know legally what it really means, terrorist organization referring to a domestic group. We don't know what he's going to do with it. And let's make something very clear. He is going to abuse it, and every president after him is also going to abuse this new power he creates. And when pushed on it, they're going to reference their predecessors that got away with it with no legal repercussions. I have no tears to cry for Antifa. They are not good people. It's basically do everything fascists do in an effort to beat fascists. Congratulations, you did it. I do not weep any tears for them, but it's Vermin Supreme. Vermin Supreme posted a quote, and I'm going to whip it out and read it real quick because it really, really makes the point for me. I can get to it quickly. Give me just a second. Here we go. He posted a quote by Martin Niemoyer. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. So that was we had gotten an input and a question by a local libertarian here in North Carolina, also active in the Libertarian Party of North Carolina. He wanted to ask Joe Garcia about what was the party's role about the anarchism in the economics and social issues going on in the party today. And I think where John was trying to ask that was about in relation to the riots, because I think that's where the wings of the Libertarian Party are kind of a little bit in conflict here, where the more anarchist side is probably a lot more sympathetic to the rioters because they are essentially rioting for the right reason. It's just that their execution of it with the complete destruction of private property that had nothing to do with the death of George Floyd was unjustified and uncalled for. But the fact that they are actually rioting against the state is something that the anarchist wing of the Libertarian Party is championing. And then there's the other side of the Libertarian Party, probably what I would call the pragmatic wing, that is kind of appalled at that, and they may be getting their roots more from the I hate to say this term, but more conservative leanings of saying, well, at the same time, there's a legitimate use for the police and everything, and this has gone too far, and, there are businesses being destroyed. So I think, as Joe Garcia summed it up pretty much, that what's been going on is that you can oppose both. You can oppose both the riots and the cop killings of innocent civilians. There's a way to be angry at both, and I think that's what we are to be appalled by both. And, with that going on, in retrospect here, is that when Donald Trump was, labeling Antifa as a terrorist organization, I have a theory about Donald Trump, and I'm going to give you guys this theory, this insight that I've developed. And to give you a little bit of a background, I was a Trump supporter. I'd say that term loosely in 2016 because I was already a libertarian conservative at that time. But I did believe that Donald Trump was so dynamically different from your traditional Republican and especially from the Democrats. I thought he would shake the system a little bit. He didn't do that, obviously. And consequently, his rise into the party power and later the presidency is pretty much the final straw reason why I became a libertarian. But I've developed a theory that I have observed about Donald Trump. And one of these theories is that Trump will often send out a tweet that is designed, I think he purposely does this. He designs it to capture media attention. Usually it's negative attention, but it's to draw the people's attention away from something else that's going on in the country. And so I think that what he was doing with this, with trying to label Antifa as a terrorist organization, is that he is both simultaneously trying to project that he's doing something about the riots, to calm everything down, to go after the so-called, the violent wing of it, and also to distract from the fact that riots are going on around the country today. So, that's my own take on that, and I personally think it's now what the riots have done is that we're all talking about the riots, and George Floyd's death is becoming less and less talked about. That's become the horrifying thing is that, in retrospect, and I think you pointed this out with the death of the other young African-American male, what was his name?
Ahmaud Arbery.
What was his name? Ahmaud Arbery. That you pointed out is that, now justice may have to be served in the court of public opinion. And I think that's what's going to happen today with the cops. I think most definitely Officer Chauvin he's been brought up on charges for third-degree murder. To recap on what third-degree murder is that is something where if you inflict injuries upon somebody that leads to their death, but your intent was not to kill them, but it ends up killing them, then it is resulting in third-degree murder. And I think that's going to be an appropriate charge. But I think for what these riots have done is that it has pretty much sealed in the deal that no matter what, and I'm not trying to defend the officer, but in this sense, every person has rights. He has the right to be defended. I have a feeling that no matter what, the verdict will be guilty, because if not, all hell will break loose. So the political powers that be will ensure that Chauvin is sealed behind bars, for better or for worse. We may say good, he should be, or not, but either way, it is now in the court of public opinion, and unfortunately, we are now under mob rule, which could later on lead to martial law if we're not careful, because the other thing that has been threatened is Donald Trump has been threatening to send in the military, and state governors have been threatening. I think a couple of states have already called upon the National Guard, which I understand why they're resorting to that, but it's incredibly horrifying to realize that we're getting put under martial law for this, and there's essentially, we're torn between, we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. I'm having a hard time talking here because I ultimately have got so many emotions about this that it's hard to go over. What are your thoughts about that? About the idea that there's the National Guard is being called in by certain state governors, or at least being tossed around, and Trump threatening military force.
Escalation of force brings escalation of force. I mean, we're in an Orwellian nightmare. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not going to claim to. Either all this shit blows over, everybody goes home, or it escalates and gets worse. I mean, no riot ever lasted forever, but the French Revolution did last for a couple of years. It's ugly, and there's no good answer. I wish I had something better. The one good thing that seems to be coming out of this is we are decentralizing free press. For my entire life, when I was in high school, if you wanted to cite a news article, it had to be from a reliable mainstream source. And we see more and more that those mainstream sources are not reliable. They're pushing their own agendas. If you check, I am trying to cite something and I can't remember exactly what it is. I have this little media checker that I love. If you search, CNN bias or Fox News bias, it's a website that comes up and it tries to, in its own way, evaluate the reliability and the bias of other media outlets, and all the mainstream ones are going way left or way right, and are picking and choosing their articles and deliberately misconstruing things. You would be amazed how unreliable our reliable sources are. But when I say we are decentralizing that, all of us saw the video of George Floyd's death before any politician made a tweet about it and before any mainstream article picked up the story. All of us knew Minneapolis was in flames before there was any article about it. We now get bombarded by primary sources before we ever get to read an article of a reporter interpreting it for us. This is a good thing. It's also a dangerous thing because, as we all know, it's easy to see a video and not get the full perspective. But with everyone having a smartphone, usually there's multiple angles. We see the video goes viral because it's terrible, and we all say, where's the context? And then suddenly 2 or 3 more videos of different angles surface that only go viral because the first one went viral and everyone had questions. We may actually be breaking press free of its traditional chains, which is, hopefully it's a good thing. Moving forward, it's going to be, we'll see what happens with it. But that seems to be a good thing.
Right. One of the things I can tell you that's happening now, go ahead.
Well, there's something I would kind of like to end on. You can go ahead with that.
Sure. So before we end that, the last thoughts that I have, first off, Joe's response, I think, was largely appropriate. And basically, I cannot pull her exact posting, but she posted it on. But essentially what it was. To
clarify, are you talking about Joe Garcia, me, or Joe Jorgensen, the presidential candidate?
Good point. So to clarify, I mean the presidential candidate, Joe Jorgensen, who is presidential candidate, Libertarian Party. We went over the Republican response, and Democrat responses have been basically to try to resort to the National Guard after letting the violence spill out into the streets for 3 days. Joe Jorgensen came out and basically she understood and was sympathetic to why the rioters were rioting, which I think is very understandable. And I think her calls for that were to address the fact that, there's these cop killings that have been going on. There's been, especially with African-American males being killed, and there's white-on-black crime that's been going on all this time. And, whether arguments abound about whether that is actually true racism or whether this is just skewed because it's cherry picking and, you're not seeing all the other types of crimes, regardless of which, this has escalated to a boiling point. And so I think what Jorgensen's response to this, her approach to this, was to try to calm and soothe that tide, to basically say and acknowledge that, she understands. That being said, I was hoping, and I guess, because she's still just a presidential candidate, I was hoping that she would be a little bit more engaged to develop what would have been her policy and how would she react in this situation. For me personally, I believe that the President of the United States, when reacting to this situation, when there's a riot that breaks out, is that is that state's responsibility. So the issue of federalism should take place, that the states can govern best on those things. The fact that Donald Trump was threatening to send in the own military force, which would probably most likely have been the Army, is absolutely insane because, as you pointed out, Joe, that escalates. Now, that being said, the governor might send in the National Guard, but if so, that's Minnesota's governor's choice. If it breaks out in Atlanta, Georgia, and Georgia's governor decides to send in the National Guard, that's Georgia governor's choice. But I think that the libertarian approach on the national level should have been to kind of stay out of it. Basically try to calm things down and try to issue from a point of leadership, but to basically let the states work out the issues at best, because the states are much closer to the problem than Washington, D.C., which is, 600-700 miles away from any other given state or city, if not 2,000 or 3,000 miles away.
No, I agree with all that.
So,
I think we're running pretty... What are we doing on time right now? We're at an hour and 12 minutes. If you're okay with it, I'm going to wrap up on my last point.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Well, we did mention, we all see videos now before they're ever in an article, and there's a new one coming out in, I think it's Dallas. I would love to talk about it next week, but I'm going to talk about it now because hopefully I may be saving somebody's life. The video shows I'll describe what it is and not just what you see, because there's now multiple angles. There's a store owner in Dallas. There's rioting, allegedly store owner. The narrative is store owner, but you don't know that for fact. Who was supposedly trying to protect their business and deter these rioters. Long story short, they attempt to disengage. I don't know what happens before the camera is rolling, but they're attempting to disengage. They're trying to walk away. People are throwing things at them. Fleeing does not work, so they attempt to fight. They go after one of the rioters, and 25 people mob this person and just murder him in cold blood. And you see every bit of it. The killing blow was a skateboard to the head after they were already on the ground. It is very gruesome. It was murder in cold blood. But let me say this to anyone listening who's maybe a business owner and thinking about getting out there and defending their property. You have a right to defend your property. You do. But let's make something clear. If you were the person that thought, I don't need a gun, we're not in times where who needs a gun? Nobody needs a gun in modern America. And now you have decided you need one, or now you realize you need one, it is too late. You do not prepare for the storm in the storm. If you did not prepare yourself for this situation, stay home And whatever you come back to when all this is over, a looted business, so be it. Your business got looted. This guy was out there with a stick. I'm going to describe something in biology, and I am no biologist, so if a biologist comments on this or calls in or something like that and tells me I'm an idiot and I'm wrong, so be it. But when you observe videos of, say, a wolf pack going after a prey animal, a deer or an elk, the deer and the elk are not restraining themselves. They are absolutely fighting for their life for everything they can, because it is either I leave this scenario wounded or I leave this scenario dead. The predators are actually more restrained. They're more cautious because, again, for the elk, this is life or death. For the wolf, if the wolf overextends itself and exposes itself to unnecessary risk and catches a hoof to the mouth and has a broken jaw, that wolf is going to die. The wolf didn't have to die in this scenario, but now the wolf's going to die from a fairly minor injury if it gets its leg kicked and gets a broken leg. A minor injury on a predator is lethal. Now, essentially, we mentioned this expression earlier, but not in this scenario by any means. It is socializing risk. The pack of wolves takes down the animal. They're all moving on it. They're nipping at it. They're trying to bring it down. No one animal exposes itself to too much risk, but they all get in on the games. You see this with these rioters. I was a bouncer for 2.5 years. I've been the elk and the deer in this situation, and I've seen a mob of people all trying to egg themselves on and all try to be the one to make the move on me, but they're all a little scared too. If you seriously injure one of these attackers, they'll leave you alone. But you're not going to seriously avoid any situation where you're exposing yourself to these kinds of problems, because then you're the aggressor. But if you tuck up in your own building and you defend it with a firearm, you shoot somebody, the rest will leave. Nobody's going to die to loot the iPhone out of your store. Nobody's going to die for that pair of shoes. But they will mob you and your stick and hit you over the head with a skateboard. The bottom line, if you did not properly prepare for this scenario, stay home. Joe, I hope I maybe saved somebody's life with that.
Yeah,
and guys,
I'm going to jump in here a little bit.
Yeah,
I think you made some good points. It's probably better not to go out and risk some kind of disaster if you're the store owner. But at the same time, I mean, if you own a business, you put your heart and soul into it, and that's your livelihood. I can understand somebody wanting to go out and defend it, but yeah, if you don't have the proper tools for the job, then it's probably better just to stay home, and hopefully you've got some insurance that'll cover the damage. But I think that was a good point you brought up, and I like the metaphor. There was a biologist that called in, but I refused to let them on the air. Got your back there, Joe.
Thank you. By the way, everyone, this is Paul. You've all heard Pam, and I want to say some things about Pam. Pam is not a libertarian, but she is fiercely passionate about free press and fiercely passionate about opposing censorship. And even though she does not hold our views, she has poured 30 or 40 hours into getting this show up off the ground, because she simply believes that even people that disagree with her need to have that voice. We're off the ground, so she has stepped back because she doesn't really want to be overly involved in a program that's spouting things she herself does not believe in. This is her replacement, Paul. Paul is a friend of mine and Joe, and we are happy to have him.
And guys, I need to make a clarification. So earlier we had a caller who dropped off and wanted to ask a question to Joe Garcia, and it was John from North Carolina. What he wanted to ask him, he had messaged us on Facebook. And guys, if you want to reach out to us, you can reach out to us at antifederalistradio@gmail.com, or go to our Facebook page titled Anti-Federalist Radio. And John from North Carolina was wanting to ask Joe about his views on anarchism within the Libertarian Party, and especially when it comes to economic and social issues. So just to give that kind of clarification on there, because I made a slight error before. So with that, I think that will do it for tonight's episode. I want to thank everybody who has participated in this. We especially want to give a big thank you to Joe Garcia for taking the time to give us his specialized background on what's been going on, and especially the roles and stresses that police officers have to go through to make everyday decisions, to give us a better frame of understanding, and also to solidify that once again, the killing and death of George Floyd under any circumstances should not have ever happened. This was a huge, terrible mistake that was done, and unfortunately, it has been incredibly costly to our society, as it has culminated in the rise of violent force all throughout the country. So with that, stay tuned, and we will be back on the same time next weekend, most likely next Sunday night at about 8 to 8:30, and follow us on Facebook, like our page, and we will update you accordingly. And with that, this is Anti-Federalist Radio, and we're signing out.
Welcome to Anti-Federalist Radio, providing you with libertarian perspectives and opinions on current events for the liberty-minded.